Thank you so much. Hello, good evening, and welcome to this, the TooFatLardies Oddcast. And today's a very special Oddcast as we've shunned the studio and moved for one episode only into the new workshop. This isn't the old messy workshop that we know and love. Tell us, Richard, where are we today, and can you just paint a picture for the listener?
I might paint a wall for them, actually, the way things are. We're not
Somebody
quite...
should.
Somebody should, yeah, indeed. We are in C Block on the Lard Island Industrial Estate. We're in the new workshop and storage area. And this is going to be a dedicated area where we can build our terrain, maybe paint our figures, and store all our terrain so everything's neatly racked out. One of the things that we've been finding is we've grown and grown, not just around the waist, is that obviously we've accumulated more and more figures and more terrain, and we've got to the point where we just need a bit more space. So the old B block, which was the workshop, and post room, is now just going to be the post room and stock room, and this C block where we are today is the workshop. It's not finished at the moment, unfortunately.
There is a lot going on in here, though, isn't there? I mean, there is a lot going on in here. I mean, we don't have any heating, but fortunately the sun's shining, and so far we've not got hypothermia. And we do have some Kendal mint cake, of course, just in case.
Well, I'm not surprised, Sid, actually, you've got Kendal mint cake, because you've been on a rather long journey.
Hasn't he?
Not around the world in 80 days, but around the podcasts in about 8 days. You've just about you've just about been on every podcast out there, mate, in the last 8 days.
There are some untouched by me at the moment, but yes, I have done the podcast circuit with Neil and Mike on Meeples and Miniatures, and then on Henry High's Battle Chat.
The Henry-thon.
The Henry-thon. Both were
Henry's thong.
It's like a marathon. It's like a marathon, but with Henry and without the peanuts.
Both were a little longer than I first thought, but both were good.
That's nice.
That's all I can say to that. Both were very good fun.
Well,
I enjoyed them both.
It's been wonderful to listen to you, to have you in the car and in the kitchen and in the shower.
Yeah.
I'm not doing the same thing in each one of those locations.
And locked in that secret room. I was very interested actually to hear you on Henry. I thought some of the 16th, 17th century stuff was really nice, really interesting. But I was a bit concerned when Henry was talking about the First World War stuff, the Great War stuff. Said he mentioned a mincing machine. I thought that was a bit offensive to you, really.
I've not brought out my mincing machine for some time. I shall have to do that again.
Right.
It's a French mincing machine as well, for those who don't know. It's very popular with the Germans. Anyway, so we move swiftly on from that. And because we're in a different venue, we thought we'd do something slightly different today and have a show about something just workshop related. So we're going to focus today on figure painting. And after the last Oddcast, we were chatting about how we paint figures, and we very rapidly realised that we all had our own technique. So I know a lot of the people out there are listening to the Oddcast while you're painting. So I thought it would be fun to talk about that subject for the show.
Because we were rather horrified at your base coating method.
There were some base coating horrors which were described by me, which quickly trended on Twitter for about 2 nanoseconds. So we can explore that. But it's a huge subject. So I thought what we'd do here was just talk about painting figures. Maybe then we could do another show on vehicles and terrain. But for now, it's just small people we're going to be focusing on. So yes, that's a nod to you, Mike.
Very good. A small nod.
A small nod.
A small nod, Mike.
And we've been... So logically, I thought we'd start at the very beginning, and it's a very fine place to start. And we're going to start to talk about preparing figures. So Nick, how do you go about preparing your figures for wargaming?
Are we talking about going from the very top when they come out the packet?
Yeah, when they come out the packet. Definitely.
Well, that's the first thing you do, get your little craft knife out. So we all have one of these, and we just trim off the little bits of flash that drive us all mad. And then, so if I'm going to take these figures out of the packet and go straight for painting, is this the idea? Yep.
Yeah. Well, how do you prepare them? How do you prepare them once you get them out of the packet so they're ready for painting?
Well, I am the steptoe and son of painting, really. You know, I've got no snobbishness about the way that I go around my stuff. I don't follow very complicated methods at all, and equally, I don't always do the same things at the same time time after time. But generally, I will trim the figure, make sure it's in a fit state to paint, and then I will fix it onto whatever it is I'm going to paint it on. Now, for me, I tend to paint figures on the base that they are going to be based on. So if I'm doing World War II figures, and they're on, normally we use pennies for individual soldiers and 2p's for leaders, then I will put them onto that 1p or 2p, and I'll do that using either a bit of super glue, or more likely I'm going to use something like No More Nails, which is a easily available big toothpaste tube. Stick a blob on the coin, stick the figure in it, next one done, and just let that dry, and they're ready to roll.
Can I ask, with No More Nails, do you then use that to move away from the base and fill up the penny, so you've got a kind of smooth surface rather than a raised base, or do you just use it as a glue?
Not at that point. I just use it as a glue. Yeah, so it's just a brown penny with a white blob and a bit of metal sticking out the top of the figure.
Okay.
Complicated, eh?
No, just interesting. It's different to the way I do it. Okay, so what specific tools do you use at this point? You mentioned clippers. What sort of make are they?
Yeah, no, I just use a craft knife, yellow and black sort of Stanley style knife, just to trim off the bits and pieces around the edge. I've got a small set of files, that modeller's files that you can use to, if there's gaps between the arm and the body that have got a bit of flash on them, you can tidy it up with that.
Yeah. If
there's anything that needs to be changed on the figure, then I'll use green stuff. Everybody uses a bit of green stuff, right? I think we'll probably all talk about green stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
And then a set of small tools that you use to shape that and craft that. And at that point in the preparation, that's probably about it for me. I don't spend a lot of time on that.
Sid?
Generally the same. I'm mainly converting and preparing metal figures, so what follows goes really for metal as opposed to plastic. But pretty much the same. I don't wash the figures first. I know that's more of a plastic sort of thing. So the figures come out of the package, clean them up, take the flash off. Sometimes there's mould lines, not so much flash, but more mould lines.
Yeah.
File those down using a set of very small files. When I was over in Antwerp this year, I found a pack of really small files. I mean, they're only about 3 or 4 centimetres long, but they're diamond sort of tipped, and they're really small, getting in all the little sort of places between the hands and under the arms and stuff. So clean everything up with files, then larger files to sharpen up any sword points or sword edges. Any head conversions or arm conversions, they come off at that point. Then drill out the head and the body, put a piece of wire in, glue all that together. What else have we got? Green stuff and brown stuff and grey stuff. So green stuff I tend to use for most of the conversions, but if you want something sharper, there's other sort of putties you can get, like brown stuff and grey stuff, and you get more of an edge on those. And it's better for doing things like chainmail and sort of intricate sort of lace.
Right. So brown stuff is a new one on me.
Yeah,
I've been in Derby for 30, 40 years.
Yeah,
what's brown stuff?
The brown stuff and grey stuff, they're both used by sort of sculptors mainly to add on to basically a green stuff figure. So you make your green stuff figure. This green stuff's quite
squidgy.
It's quite squidgy, yeah. It's viscous. Hasn't really got that edge. It's very difficult to get a really sharp edge on it. So you would add some grey stuff and brown stuff made exactly the same way. It's basically a hard setting epoxy, and you can really get that down to much finer lines. It's perfect for things like sword edges, bayonets, anything where you want a really crisp line on the bottom of a cloak, say, for instance. So sometimes use those in conjunction with each other. The grey stuff in particular, which I think is Procreate, is really nice stuff to use. I've got a set of old dental tools which I bought years and years ago, and they have a series of, almost like if you think of a spade on a playing card, there's a number of the sort of the tools which have that sort of spade type carving edge, and that's really useful for sort of putting edges on things and basically embellishing whatever the putty use you're doing. Richard's just holding one up, which is almost exactly like the one I've got. Yeah. And you can find those really pretty cheaply. You can buy a pack of those for about £10, I think, or €15 or whatever. Yeah. So with all of that, then sandpaper down some of the mould lines. So you're getting, once you've carved away any of the mould lines, you sandpaper down very quickly with a really, really fine wet and dry. And then you're basically ready to go.
Oh, really? On a metal figure, you use a grey wet and dry paper?
Yeah. Certainly when, you often get mould lines which run down the whole figure, down the arm and then down the leg. And generally, you can, if you're filing away, you just sort of, it can be quite you can get some quite edges when you've filed away. If you just run a sort of wet and dry down the arm and down the leg, you get a really smooth erosion of that moulding line, which means that when you undercoat and when you paint, you just don't pick up anything on a dry brush.
And how long does that take you, Sid? So my method, for instance, so far I've got them out the pack, I've trimmed the flash off, I've whacked them on the bit of glue and they're on the base ready to go. So that's taken me, let's say for 10 figures, that's taken me a minute. Well, how long would you have spent on doing that?
Why don't you just throw them straight in the bin at this stage? Right?
Well, we can talk about differences you get in outcome, but it's also about what time you have available to put in,
that's very true.
So for me, that's the approach that works for me. But how long do you reckon it takes you, Sid, to get to that point?
10 figures.
Excellent point. Well, 10 figures would probably take about half an hour, a bit longer than that.
Right.
So I would figure on a battalion of 24 infantry, or would take about an hour to really clean up, and that's just doing it pretty full on. And these are 25, 28mm figures. So there is a time investment there.
And can I ask you a question as well, because you tend to do more pike and shot.
Yes.
So you have figures that have pointy sticks in their hands.
Yeah.
Now some of these come with pointy sticks sort of already moulded on, which generally are not very pointy and can look a bit odd. And some of them come, of course, with huge gaps, where you're trying to put what looks like quite a thin pole in quite a large hand.
What do you
do with your pointy sticks, Sid?
I always take spear. Well, it goes to the Dark Ages or pike and shot or anything which is carrying a non-musket or non-rifle. I always try and take those out. To be honest, I don't really like the pikes which end up being bendy. So if you're hoplites or if you're Scottish Schultrons or Spanish tercios, always take the pikes out and re-drill the hands, or if the hands are there. You can buy wire in different thicknesses, and you normally find a sort of the wire to sort of go into the hand so it looks okay. Sometimes if that doesn't work, I've got a pair of pliers which I've filed down the bit on the pliers which is rigged and ribbed, so you sort of file that down and then you can close the hands around the pike. And the other thing I do is I always use epoxy resin. I never use super glue. I always think so. Arrow dye epoxy resin, the 5-minute stuff or the 90-second stuff, depending on what you're doing, it always forms a really hard bond and it's easy to paint. I always feel with super glue that there's a risk that it goes brittle at some point.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just use epoxy resin for everything these days.
And I use super glue. I use a lot of super glue, and the threat is exactly that. You never quite know exactly when you're going to pick the figure up, and the whole thing's going to fall on the floor.
So I think the investment of going from an epoxy to glue stuff,
especially with plastic figures, often the super glue with plastic figures it just creates a sort of a bond, but it doesn't do what the plastic glue would do, which is ideally melt the two sides together, so it knits them together.
Well, I find that especially true with a lot of the warlord figures that we use, because warlord quite like to have people standing on one leg.
Yes,
and people standing on one leg.
Doing it.
Of course, often standing on one leg. People standing on one leg, figures that are on one leg are quite. I super glue them. So, for instance, I'll probably glue them rather than use the white. The hard as nails, whatever it's called.
Right.
No more nails. I'll probably super glue a plastic figure to the penny base that it's going to be based on. But very mindful of the fact that actually that's going to be fragile until I can build the base up around that.
Yeah. You can hide a multitude of sins once you use your basing materials in terms of keeping things in place. Yeah. That's interesting. I'm probably more inclined towards your methods, Nick. I mean, I tend to use a big set of toenail clippers to remove any obvious flash off metal figures. Just where you get those big bits of flash pointing out, I use that. Especially if anybody's familiar with Perry miniatures, will often find you get kind of little spidery bits of mould flash, especially for some reason around the musket ball pouches and things like that. And so I just use a set of nail clippers to clip them off. I use microfiles, just ones I got cheap off the market for a couple of quid. Mine are about 6 inches long with a plastic handle, so you can just... and I guess the thickness would be 3-4 mil at the most. And a scalpel or a craft knife. Funnily enough, I was fortunate that my mother was a chiropodist, and so when she became a lunatic, I was able to get all her chiropody tools, including these bits of metal here, and loads and loads of scalpels which smell vaguely of old ladies' feet, but are very good at cutting things up.
It's an interesting career exit, that, isn't it, really? You know, you become a chiropodist and then, like in Dungeons and Dragons, your next career exit is a lunatic.
Well, there you go, mate. That's what happens when you're 92.
And how do you sort of mount the figures, Rich, when you're painting them? Do you go for the gluing onto the base method so you can terrain the base up and then you're ready to go? You just got to paint the whole thing?
No.
Or are you more of a long stick man?
I'm a long stick man. I use a hot glue gun to stick them onto. A pal of mine built my War Games table about 25 years ago, and with the offcuts, he made me about a dozen sticks about a foot long, MDF, foot long, I don't know, half an inch by half an inch. It's just a stick, basically. And I still use them. I hot glue them onto there, unless they're plastic figures, because I find if you hot glue plastic figures onto the stick, you can't get them off, and all the paint comes off as you try to prise them off. So with those, I do stick them onto coins, and like Nick, I use pennies for individual men or tuppences, tuppenny bits for leaders. But if I'm doing plastic figures, I have bought some Citadel clippers, which are really good to get a flat finish. And they're also good if you're converting, because if you're, let's say, cutting off a forearm, you want to change your hand, they leave a nice flat cut, so you can then cut the other arm and I actually drill it out. And if I'm pinning figures for a conversion, I use a pin vise drill, and I use paper clips, because they're nice bendy bits of steel. They're cheap as chips. You get thousands for £1, and you just poke that in. And I tend to put that in with super glue. Once that's dried, I then use plastic glue on that, and then so the two arms will blend together. At that point, I've never used sandpaper. Whatever the figures, never use sandpaper. But I'm probably too lazy. I just think, oh well, those gouge marks I use with my file, I won't ever notice because I'm too blind anyway.
I think one of the interesting things about painting is staying motivated, and I find one of the really demotivating things can be once you've painted your figure, then you've got to base your figure. So I much prefer Nick's route of going down, you're basing the figure at the start and you're texturing the base and you're all ready to go. That's all you've got to do.
I don't texture the base at the beginning. I'll probably texture the base last. Okay. So all the way through the painting process, this figure will just be glued onto a bare penny or a bare tuppence or a bare. Sometimes I use different bases, obviously. And if it's going to be a figure that's going to go on a multiple base, like an artillery crew or something, then I might just sort of even hold it on with a bit of blue tack or something.
That's interesting. So I think that multiple base, once you've got the figures based, and if you texture them, then all you've got to do is paint. But the disadvantage of that is you've got to paint around the figures. Yeah.
Well, sometimes, so crew serve weapon, I'm just thinking about this now. So Vickers machine gun, for instance, I will probably glue more or less the whole thing in place on the base that I'm going to use.
The Vickers or the men?
Probably everything, actually.
Right,
if I think it's going to be too fiddly to try and plug it in the end, I just do it all in once. And then undercoat the whole thing from that point. Take it on from there as one piece.
And the answer is, I suppose, if you can't see it to paint it, nobody's going to see it when it's on the table.
Well, there are people that would say that, for sure.
That's exactly where I got to on all the First World War crew served stuff.
Yeah, I remember you doing that.
Vickers, so I just glued everything together, glued it all down, textured the base, and if you couldn't see what was... if there was areas in shadow, they stayed black because you wouldn't be able to see them. And it's always that 3 feet away test, and I'm completely guilty of not following that. But if you're 3 or 4 feet away, you won't be able to see the detail, which is somebody's abdomen in a crew serve weapon with a gun. You're just not going to be able to see that.
What colour do you paint abdomens?
We'll come on to that.
Okay.
But he does lots of research.
So we've moved on from mounting the figures to now we'll think about undercoating the figures, which of course is a hot topic.
Well, we know how you do it, wrongly.
But how do you do it, Richard? Tell us.
I spray. I just get car sprays from the local cheapo car maintenance shop, which I think is actually called Cheapo Car Maintenance. And I get big aerosol cans that are about 18 inches high for £5, £4.99. And ordinarily, I will paint undercoat in black, sometimes in brown. So, for example, if I'm doing British, World War II, be they 8th Army sort of yellowish clothing, or Northern Europe brown khaki clothing, I'll undercoat them in brown. If I'm doing bad guys, so like the Japanese or the Germans, I'll always undercoat them in black. Because it gives them an evil tinge.
Yes, they're evil.
No, I mean, obviously black suits the German uniform, but I did when I did my Japanese, who actually are they're wearing greens, and the tops are more middle stony yellows. I still went with a black undercoat because I wanted them to look a bit more harsh. I find that giving them a brown undercoat can often end up with a softer result, whereas a black undercoat can end up with a bit more of a harsh result, which I quite like when you get stark contrast in the uniform. So the Japanese, the trousers I did in Russian uniform, Vallejo Russian uniform, and the tops I did in Middlestone, just as base colours. Excuse me, and that does give you quite a sharp contrast, which I liked on the black. Sometimes I will use grey, but that would only be if I was painting something like an Austrian Napoleonic army where it's coming out in a white uniform, and there's not many armies that have a white uniform. Finns, for example, if I was doing the Winter War, I'd probably use
anybody
a grey
in a snow outfit.
undercoat. Anybody in a snow outfit, yeah, absolutely. So that's it for me. I just spray them on the stick, and I don't do anything else clever.
Just one spray, or do you just do another one where you turn the figures over and do the underneath?
No, I've got this stick in my hand, a bit like a sword, so I can wave it about and get the different angles. But to be honest with you, if it's imperfectly undercoated, I don't care. It'll all come out in the wash. I'm going to paint on top of it. Oh dear, there's a bit of silver there. Never mind. It's not there now. It's green.
Yeah.
How about you, Nick?
Not too dissimilar to Rich, I guess. I suppose it's unsurprising, really, that we should follow fairly similar models. So I would spray my undercoat. I might prime, depending on what I'm looking at. See, I don't know really. So if I'm doing a grey undercoat, I will often use the primer, a grey primer, and that will be the undercoat. So if I'm doing Napoleonics, or as Richard said, anybody who's got some white on them, then I will generally use a grey undercoat, because I've undercoated with brown and with blacks for Napoleonics, and one of the issues I have with white paint is finding a white paint that's got decent pigment to actually go over a black or a dark cover.
Same with yellows as well.
So I tend to use grey with anybody who's wearing like a light coloured uniform. Mostly I will be undercoating with a black spray or a brown spray, and I'm a bit more upmarket than you, Rich. I buy my sprays from Halfords, so I don't just go cheapo car showroom. I go top of the range, mate. And I get they do a black matte, which is a spray black matte. Halfords also do a camouflage spray paint range, which I thought was taking the piss when I first saw it. Go out and buy a sort of pot of camouflage paint. But they do a green and a brown, and both of those actually
a khaki. On your recommendation, I tried one last weekend and I bought a khaki.
Well, there you go. And they actually make great undercoats as well, because they give a really good coverage. So sometimes if I'm doing Yanks, I will use a green undercoat, because that saves you a lot of time at the end of the day. I'm very much, but it will be a spray. And for me, what I do, unlike Richard, mine are not on a stick. I've got a little little frame that I put the figures in, ready to spray, out in the garage, like a little, a box with
a tray or something.
No, imagine a shoebox with the lid removed and turned on its side.
Right.
So I just
is that what it is?
Pretty much.
You've got a shoebox.
And it's a bit longer than that. It's actually a frame that was made many years ago. So it's probably about about that long. What's that? 2.5 feet, 3 feet long.
It's 2'4".
If you imagine a shoebox, but the shoes are being, you put clown shoes in them, right? They'd be a bit like that. So you stand the figures up, and therefore with the open side facing you, and then I spray into that. So I spray them one side, leave it 10 minutes, go back, turn them around, spray the other side, make sure you get up into all the nooks and crannies as best you can, lay them flat and spray again. So it probably takes me 3 or 4 sprays to cover any lot of figures. But then the whole lot of figures, a whole lot are covered, including the underside of the bases, and
you lie them down.
Most of the garage as well. Anything any washing that happens to be there, whatever, it's all there. It's all covered out by that. But yeah, so spray for me. I have used brush undercoats, and I tend to use like a, just an acrylic black for that.
Interesting.
But not
Okay.
not often.
So I'm still with, as probably people know from the other podcast, I still like the Humbrol enamel black undercoat or dark earth undercoat, which is a sort of dark brown.
Funny enough, Dark Earth is the Humbrol spray can that I use if I'm doing browns, because you can't. Sorry,
good.
I didn't mention you can't get a brown car paint, so I will use the Humbrol one for that. It's a lovely colour.
Yeah, it's a really good colour, and that gives it. I think that does give a softer effect. That was a tip that I picked up from Jim Ibbotson about a year ago, and it does work really nicely. I like the process of brushing the undercoat on. I think it's kind of a relaxing thing to do. You've made the figures, you're brushing you're getting the brush onto the figures, and I think that it does allow you, when you build and glue on the cavalryman to a horse, it does allow you to get around all the parts of the horse, underneath the legs, the withers, everything else, the tail, which I feel if you spray cavalry, you can't always get underneath all the cavalryman's saddle and the horse's legs and whatever. So I think brushing on an undercoat with cavalry is perfect, but I do like it just for normal figures. I'm not generally painting up more than 25 figures at a time, so it's not as if I'm undercoating 100 figures. So I did try, as you probably know, after Christmas, I did try the sprayed undercoat, and that wasn't a great experience. I think I probably screwed that up myself. So
you really played the blame game with that as well,
I
didn't
did.
you? Pointing the finger at people unfairly in public.
Hardly. the great people at the Humbrol company, not the Humbrol, the Halfords. Great people at Halfords, and but
I was thinking about Benito. Our friend Benito in Madrid. You pointed a finger at him very publicly and criticised him. I thought that was really unfair of you, actually.
So I decided to stick with the painted on undercoat, but horses for courses, and that gets me and has got me through about 30 years of undercoating. So
great. So the figures are there now, ready to go. The undercoat's dried. Is it?
They are. That's right.
Yeah, that's where we're up to.
So the next question is, what do we do next?
Yeah, what do we do?
Paints.
Well, paint the bleeding figure, mate. That's it, isn't it?
What paints are we going to use? What paints do we use? Do we use one brand? Do we use just one type?
No.
Do we have favourite paints? Let's start off with you, Richard. What's your painting approach as regards which paints to use?
Which paints? I mainly use Vallejo. I really like the dispensing bottles that they've got. I can put the amount that I want onto a plate. Many years ago, I used to use Humbrol enamels at the very outset, as that was what we all painted with before acrylic paints came along, or before we discovered them in the hobby. Then I went on to Humbrol acrylics, which I quite liked, but I didn't really like the pots. Often, somehow, the pots would seem to jam up with paint, and you'd put the lid back on, and the lid wouldn't be on, and the next time you went back, it was completely done in. And so when the Vallejo bottles appeared, I really, really liked those. I have used Citadel. I like Citadel. I like their 3-colour range. I think they're really nice paints to use. But again, I'm not really keen on pots with lids. It just doesn't really do it for me. And I find that Vallejo, I've got bottles of Vallejo paint that I must have had for 10, 15 years that I'm still using because they really, really keep nicely. And the other thing I use, Army Painter washes. Excuse me. I think I've been inhaling too much of it. But yeah, Army Painter washes, by which I don't mean the dips in the tin. I mean the little bottles, very, very similar to the Vallejo's things, which I think are really great. I used to use the Citadel washes, and actually, when they stopped doing them, I bought up loads of pots of their flesh wash, which was a fabulous colour. And I've still got, I think I'm on the last tin of it now, but it's lasted.
Is that
me for 15
green
years.
flesh?
No, it was called flesh wash.
Okay.
And it was in a little plastic pot, about 1.25 inches high and about 1 inch round, 1.25 inches round, and it had a little flip lid in a hard plastic. Black plastic, and I just really like that flesh wash. If I can't find that now, I tend to use Army Painter Red mixed with Army Painter Soft Tone, and just mix it up with a bit of water to do a flesh wash with that.
So when you're washing the figures, you're washing them with a brush, and you're washing them over a single base colour.
No, I don't use them for washing the whole figure. That's later in the process. What I do when I'm painting a figure is I will paint the trousers brown, the jacket blue, the hat pink, the face flesh colour, the rifle brown, the hands pink, the boots blue, whatever. And then, once that is all done, just in pure block colours, maybe I'm running ahead of us where we're going, but let's go with it. Then I will use an army paint to dip a tin exactly like this one here, which is indeed dark tone. I tend to use dark tone or strong tone, never soft tone because it's not strong enough for me. Excuse me, I'm coughing like an old tramp here. But so I
keep talking. Let's see you suffer a bit more.
Yeah, I really like them. I really like that. It's help yourself. Open it up.
I'm just going to open it up and have a look at it.
Nick's just going to have a drink of this.
Well, I might be having a go in a minute to stop myself coughing.
A few sniffs.
It is. It's a right old hobgoblin-y mix of whatever. But I don't dip it and flick it as they originally recommended.
Smells like gloss paint.
It does.
For people listening, Nick has passed me the lid of the tin as if it was a cork from a wine bottle.
Yeah.
It does smell like gloss paint. If you can imagine that smell you get when you open a can of gloss paint, you're in that awful situation when you're asked to paint something in the house that isn't your figures, and you can that smell of
So
this is army painting quick shade, dark tone.
This is dark tone, which I use this with pretty much most things I do. If I was doing something with very, very colourful, this is what I use mainly for World War II. If I was doing something with with brighter tones, like medieval, let's say, where you've got lots of reds and blues and so on and so forth, I would use their strong tone.
How do you apply this?
I apply it with a brush. I apply it with a pigskin brush, which looks exactly like this. Squeak, piggy, squeak.
Oh, yeah.
Which is got very. In fact, this one looks like it's been sat in the stuff.
That one wasn't cleaned last time.
Clearly,
that one could be used as a dart to kill somebody with.
It's got very, very rough old bristles, which you can just splash it all over.
And again, they are trying to describe it. If you can take yourself back to when you're 5 or 6 years old and you're painting in a school classroom,
exactly that.
That's what you get given.
That's exactly that. My wife used to run the local brownie pack. And when she gave that up, they had a whole set of these brushes that the kids used to use to slap on PVA or make Christmas decorations. Yeah. And she said, right, well, I don't need these anymore. And I said, well, I do, because they're ideal for a bit of rough brushing. And if, like this one, you forget to wash it out, then you ain't really lost anything worth anything. You must be able to buy these for absolute pennies from any old craft store.
It's quite expensive, this quick shade. I see it's £20 a can, and the can is...
You can get it cheaper on eBay.
The can is small.
It's about half a pint. It's about half a pint.
It must say on there.
It does, but it will say in French.
250 millilitres.
There you go, it's half a pint.
Army-sized can.
Yeah.
Enough for 200 plus minis, it says.
Oh, that'll easily. I mean, I've done 200.
There's not on
No, I'm going to stamp on it. I've done 200 figures with that already, and it's nearly full.
So, Nick,
because I'm not doing that anyway.
Right.
Anyway,
is this sounding similar?
Yeah.
To
well, a few touch points, I guess, as you would imagine. I'm real split actually. I really love Citadel paints. I like the pigment of them, the feel of them, the way they flow. I think that Vallejo, I love Vallejo, but I do find that actually some of their colours flow much more nicely than others.
Undoubtedly.
And some of the whites I really struggle with on Vallejo. I even struggle to call them the same thing. One time to the next. Is it Vallejo? Is it Vallejo? Is it Vallejo? What is it? Anyway, enough of that. So I often go for Citadel. I do like this. I do like their ranges. The jars drive me a little bit nutty though. So they got these very nice little trendy pots, and you open the pot with the black lid is on a hinge, and you open the hinge out. So you open the pot, open it out like that, pick up your brush, and by the time you take your brush back to the pot, the hinge is pulled shut again. And it's a bit like I said on Twitter the other day. Sometimes getting some paint out of a Citadel paint pot is a bit like performing a tonsillectomy on an alligator. You know, you just about you can't do it. It's tricky to get in there sometimes. So you have to wedge the lid open somehow. Part of the lids I think have got a design where you can do that, but I just find that more cumbersome than anything. Anyway, so if you can get the paints out, they're really good ranges, and of course they have such ridiculous names. You know, when you're standing in front of there, I was looking at the reds.
Monkey snot.
I like to follow a kind of. We're going to talk about layers, base layer, middle layer, top layer. So on reds, I'll go something like a. You're going to love these, Rich.
Yeah.
A Wazdaka red, followed by an Evil Sun's scarlet, and a Wild Rider red on the top of that. Right, so you've got a 3. It's like the Foundry 3-coat system, really, but using the Citadel paints to do that. So I've got a mix of those. I've also got some old Humbrels. I found an old Humbrel the other day, which I think is probably 25 years old, rust colour one, and they do last really well. So I'll paint with anything. I never throw anything out.
No.
It's always there. But they're the ranges I think for me that to go to. Yeah, do you want to talk about what we use to paint different units, or what colours we use?
Well,
more the point,
I'm more interested in to understand the techniques you're using.
Right.
Shall I just go through my paints?
Splash it all over.
So there's a couple of things on what you both said. I mean, I go with Vallejo, and I moved over to those about 10 years ago. I mean, just use those almost exclusively now. I mean, there's very little I use which isn't Vallejo. I store mine upside down. So I built a rig for them so that they all turned upside down, and you can see the paint colours really easy from the base of the paints, and that always makes sure you've got a good consistency, which is really useful when you're talking about whites and yellows.
So that's what that suspension apparatus is in your garage then? It's for turning paint pots upside down?
That's one of its uses.
I thought it was something else.
That is one of its uses, that's true. I also don't really use water. I don't really dilute with water. I use acrylic flow improver. So,
I use acrylic flow improver as well, called water.
No, Windsor and Newton acrylic flow improver. If you get a palette with 6 or so depressions and you pour the acrylic flow improver, a small amount into each depression, one depression is enough really for a whole painting session, about 3 or 4 hours, and you dilute the paint with that, and using a wet palette, which is something else we might come on to, that makes the paint flow significantly better.
I might try that.
And the trick, I think, with whites and yellows, which in Vallejo aren't really that deeply pigmented, is never to start with white. It's really to start with light grey or...
What a beginner's error I've been making.
Yellow ochre. And you add the brighter colours to the top of that, which I'm sure you probably know. But acrylic flow improver and acrylic flow retarder, those are 2 really useful things you can use. The retarder is used to blend colours if you want to blend on the figure. And the flow improver I use all the time.
No,
I rarely use water.
I don't understand that. How do you mean you use a retarder to blend?
So you could, if you add paint to a retarder, it will dry slower. So that will leave you some paint on the surface of the figure, which you can then add another paint to.
Oh, I see, and the 2 will blend together because the lower surface
you
is
feather
still...
it with a brush, so that's good for horses and stuff like that.
Oh, yeah, nice.
But I mainly use the flow improver because that really helps the flow move, the smoothness of the paint move over the figure.
And you said there about you don't start with white, you add stuff to white.
Never start.
I think you should explain a bit more about
that.
We'll
probably
that's quite an advanced technique.
Yeah, we'll probably go on to that when we talk about the actual painting techniques, but that's me, and it's just Vallejo. The other thing I use, I've always got a needle there, so when the dropper bottle sort of clunks up, as it always does, especially when you're storing upside down, you can just poke the dropper hole with the needle and off you go. The other thing I was going to mention was wet palettes. Really, really easy to make.
We've got some out the back of the factory.
It's a different
I think you should say what it is from the top.
So a palette is obviously...
I don't know what it is.
Well, you could either paint from a bottle, which is easy to do, but you do find when you paint from a bottle, a small Citadel bottle, you're going to take some of the excess paint off the brush, and that's going to clog up the mechanism for closing the paint pot in itself. So you're going to want to have a palette. So you can use an old wall tile. You could use a proper painting palette. You could use anything. A sort of margarine tub lid. A wet palette is taking it one step forward. So say you've got a saucer or anything which is like a tin from a box of biscuits, but with a lip round the edge. You're going to cut a piece of sponge, probably from one of the washing up sort of sponges you could use in a kitchen, and you're going to lay that flat in that tin or that plastic top of an ice cream carton, whatever it is. You then
let's assume, for the sake of a reference point that we all have, let's assume that it's a side plate that you would have your jam sandwich on at tea time. So it's a little saucer type.
It's a
plate.
saucer, and you've got a piece of sponge which is maybe about 10 millimetres thick, which is cut to fit the saucer.
Yeah.
You then wet the sponge with a tap, so it's really, really soaking, but not so that there's water pooling on the top. And then you cut a piece of, I use greaseproof paper, which in the United Kingdom is basically the paper which you line a baking tin with to do baking. And then that's your palette, and you apply the paint to the paper. The paper gets damp and wet, and that keeps the paint from drying, at least much longer than it would do if you just had it on a perfectly flat saucer which was dry.
I bought one which was a plastic box about the size of an A4 sheet paper, and it had a lip round the outside, which I suppose was 1/2 an inch deep, 3/4 of an inch deep. And what that had in it was you bought the sheets. I bought it as a kit to see whether I'd like it, and it was like a thick blotting paper rather than a sponge. And you pour your water in that, and then again it had like tracing paper, greaseproof paper on top, and then you put your paint on the greaseproof tracing paper. But the dampness from below doesn't come through. The dampness from below can somehow permeate through the paper and keep the paint alive, but it doesn't make it go runny. So you don't get all the water go pop and all paint goes everywhere.
Fun enough, that's just what he said when he described it.
So your acrylic flow improver, when you're using your brush, clean your brush in some water. Either just normal tap water I use, but I do know people that use distilled water. And then you take your brush and you dip it into your small depression on a liquid palette of flow improver, and then that's what you're using to actually get the paint onto the brush.
And do you use that flow improver on the wet palette?
You've got it on your brush. No. That's in a separate small depression. No, it's not really. It sounds more complicated because it's one of those things when you explain it, it's difficult, but it's not really. You dip your brush in the flow improver and then you dip it in the paint. And the flow improver does make the paint more viscous. And how much you add is depending on what you're painting. You don't need to use it at all, but when you're using acrylic, Vallejo acrylics, I find that if you're painting a horse, if you just use the neat paint, it's quite slow. It speeds up considerably if you use the flow improver.
Okay, I shall have to give that a go.
It's a really nice way to paint.
I have to say that the wet palette I used for about a week and then never used it again. I went back to doing...
I never bought mine. I don't think you need to be fancy at all. It's just stuff you've got lying around. Everyone's got plastic, disposable plastic lids everywhere. It's 50 pence for a pack of about 10 of those sponges. Greaseproof paper, one roll, £1. And you've got enough to paint with for more than a year.
What I will say is that the one that I had a plastic lid that you put on over the top, like a sort of hard plastic, and the paint would be alive a week later.
Really?
You could just go back to it. So if you were mixing up an unusual colour for,
I mean, it must be a phenomenon, therefore, that people recognise. Often you watch these entrepreneur programs where someone's got a great idea for a product, and somebody says, "Well, you solved a problem that doesn't exist." I mean, is it an issue? Do you find with paints otherwise going dry?
No, I had stopped using it because I couldn't be bothered with it, to be honest with you.
But obviously, Sid, you use it for a reason. It's not just.
Sid's a bit more careful than I am,
and maybe a bit slower in a positive way about the way that he paints.
He takes more care. That's
what I see.
Yeah, I think it just is a way of putting your paints on a palette. The paper, of course, you can just throw away when you've used. When the paper's been covered with paint, it keeps a palette clean. It allows you to paint over a few hours and still be using some of the same paints that you've got in a couple of hours before. You're not constantly going back and refilling your paint, and that means that you're using less paint. You use a tiny amount of paint to paint figures, really. I mean, there's not really much paint depth on any figure.
No.
So the Vallejos you buy there, they're expensive, about £2 for a bottle. 100 of those built up over a course of 5 years will just keep you painting for years, literally.
Yeah, it probably is true that most of the paint ends up on the palette.
A bit like mustard, isn't it?
Goes on the figure.
A bit like mustard, they reckon that Coleman's mustard made a fortune on what people left on the side of their plate rather than what they ate.
Really?
So,
Well, a bit like we've moved on from painting palettes. Are there any sort of...
No, we haven't actually, because I want to tell you what I use.
Sorry.
No, yeah, and I also want to say that actually my range of paints actually. I noticed when we were researching this that a lot of my greys and blues are Vallejo. My greens tend to be a mix, but my reds and whites and all those sort of lighter, richer colours are nearly all Citadel.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Is there a reason for that, or is that accidental?
I think there is a reason. I think over time I've got to like those colours more, the richness of those colours, and for me probably in the flow as well. I don't know. Anyway,
interesting. What do you use to paint on? What palette do you use? What do you mix your paint on?
A little white thing that you buy in WH Smith's.
Oh, right.
So a little white dinner plate size with about 10 indentations.
It is a palette.
And I've had it for about 40 years. It's now less of a palette more than just a dumping ground, actually.
I use plates, little side plates. Funnily enough, I've got 3 of them, and the great thing about acrylic paint is once you finish washing out the dinner thing, just throw it in the remains of the water. And before you pull the plug out, leave it for 10 minutes, and then the acrylic paint just literally falls off it, and you've got your glazed dinner plate. It's the fact that it's glazed. It's a bit like you said about using a wall tile. Because it's glazed, the paint will just come off.
Absolutely.
But so I think, yes, we've now finished that subject.
So what I thought would be fun is that although we do not have, listeners, we do not have a best bit on the bench, but I thought what would be nice would be to think about what are the pick of the perfect paints in the pot.
Perfect paints in the pot.
What are the pick of the perfect paints in the pot?
Pick of the pops.
What do you mean by that, mate?
What do I mean by that? Well, I'm going
paint
to
pot pickers.
ask you both to choose paint pot pickers. I'm going to ask you both to choose
paint pot
6
picker.
paint tones you could not live without, other than black and white and flesh. I use the word flesh because I think we're going to be mainly painting human figures. So,
should we do one each in case there's a duplication of these, or how do you want to do it?
I think we're probably okay on doing 6 in a row. And if we duplicate, that would be quite fun, especially because I don't think anyone's going to have bright suns, turquoise or whatever, Nick.
I'll cross that one off.
So 6 paint tones from you, Richard. Which you could not live without.
Okay, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you what I use them for as well. These are all that I have. Stone grey. Stone grey is a really nice stone grey colour, which I use a lot for in Napoleonic period or World War II. Bread bags. So German infantry bread bag, Napoleonic infantry bread bag, and also it's a really nice colour for webbing, straps, things like that. Khaki, very, very similar. I like khaki because you can also mix it with browns to get a nice highlight on the brown. Russian uniform, Vallejo Russian uniform, I use for everything apart from Russian uniforms. But it's great. I mean, I know we're talking about figures today, but it's British tanks, it's Japanese uniform colour.
They do a US uniform green, which is very similar. You never use it on anything American.
It's called a perfect green base, isn't it?
Yeah, well, their German uniform colour is no good for German uniforms either, but it's a strange thing. But Russian uniform, it's great, and it's really good for tarpaulins or knapsacks and anything World War II webbing-y. Again, actually, British webbing. I would use stone grey for British webbing. I'd use Russian uniform for British webbing. I'd use khaki for British webbing. I'd mix them all up, and so all the figures have got a real mix of that 38 pattern webbing from different manufacturers, and it works really well. English uniform, not as useful as the first 3 that I've mentioned, but you can't mix any other colours to make that British Army khaki, so you've got to have that. Exactly the same as the next one, which is German field grey. I have attempted, when I haven't got German field grey in, to mix German field grey from other colours, and it fails abysmally. So I've got to have them. And finally, red leather. Ooh, I like red leather. And many of your hats, Sid, I've admired them, your red leather hats.
Red leather, everything really, Richard. We'll leave it at the hats for now.
But you can use it for an awful lot of things. You can, of course, use it for leather, but you can also use it for rust if you're doing buildings. I know we're only talking about figures here, But let's say you're painting the Tin Man. He could be rusty, so you can use it for that. You could also use it as a base coat for skin. So those are my 6. Stone grey, khaki, Russian uniform, English uniform, red leather and German field grey. But the top of the pops, mate, at the top of that would be stone grey. I couldn't do without stone grey.
That is a perfect pick of the paints in the pot. Nick, what have you got to rival that?
Well, I'm just looking through, trying to narrow mine down to 6, actually, because as always I've had more than I should have.
You've just bought every paint pot you own.
I have, yeah.
You can only have 6, Nicholas.
Well, yeah,
Only
okay,
have 6.
all right. So, one of my favourite... I'm starting at the light end of things then, Sid.
Okay.
Citadel do a colour called Ushabti Bone.
Oh, stone grey.
No, it's not.
Ushabti
It's
if
not.
you want to.
It's for painting white that isn't white.
Oh,
White is hardly ever white, isn't it?
No.
Actually, it's a really nice, really pale colour. And not too many miles away from it is another colour that I really like using, which is another Citadel one, which they call Ogrin Camo. Now, when you look at this, is a really interesting colour. When you look at the pot, it's almost green, but it's like a yellowy brown. It's kind of.
Yeah.
I do think that I struggle with a little bit of colour blindness actually, because when I look at all my Vallejo greens, and I've got thousands of them, they all look the same, right? And you blow them on there, you think, well, that's US dark green, that's olive grey, that's brown violet. They all look the bloody same. But this Ogrin Camo, which is quite a light colour, you can use it for webbing. But really interestingly, we haven't spoken about washes. I don't know if we're going to.
No, we're going to.
But
Next.
really interesting. This one makes, I think, quite a nice panzer. I know we're not talking tanks, but quite a nice panzer undercoat, which if you apply sepia wash, gives it a nice kind of darky sort of browny look. Okay, some of these are browny, so I would also go for. There's a colour with has to be reference to Jim Ibbotson. This Bane Blade Brown, or as it's otherwise known. Do you know what it's otherwise known as?
No. Brown.
Noel's Beard.
Oh, Noel's Beard,
Noel's Beard. It's that little bit of paint that you can apply around the 5 o'clock shadow.
Blobby, blobby, blobby.
Yeah. which is actually a really great, and again perfect for webbing. Really good for that. How many have I got now? That's 1, 2, 3.
I don't know. I fell asleep.
Yeah, I forgot as well. Well, I would also go for 2 more. Back to Vallejo, I go for Russian uniform green for the same reasons you got.
Rock on.
And I'd probably go for a brown violet, which is in that kind of same darkish green that could go anywhere. Camouflage.
Japanese helmets. Just used it from a Japanese helmet.
Yeah, I'm sure you have.
Which is not a euphemism.
And then I'll go. And then I'll go a bit bright on the silver front. I go for a Stormhost silver, which is a Citadel colour,
and that's let you sneak that in. I think
which with a black wash makes a really nice sort of gun metal.
Well, if we're cheating with silvers, I would go Vallejo Air silver. If you want to do swords and bayonets, the beautiful light texture of Vallejo Air with a really fabulous pigmentation in it gives you stuff that looks metallic. It really does.
Yeah. When you're saying air, that's
it's their air range. That's right.
It's
nothing to do with air dressers.
Yeah.
Right.
You apply it with a brush.
I apply it with a brush.
You don't air gun your swords.
No, I don't. What about you, Squiddly Diddly?
Well, I've got my 6. I haven't chosen the air silver, but I mean that is a fantastic colour when it's applied to the Vallejo gun method.
Yeah.
I hope we've got Etruscan or Tuscan red is going to be in this list somewhere.
Something similar. Similar actually. So I thought about 6 colours which are complementary and which you could use to paint a whole regiment, and I picked them as something which I'm doing at the moment.
Okay.
So we've got my go-to colour, my number 1 colour, which I think is amazing, is burnt umber.
Oh yeah,
Vallejo burnt umber. So
nice dark colour.
So about 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, once I painted my figure with an undercoat of black, I wanted to have something which speeded up the process. So then I'd take a large, size 3 brush and paint burnt umber over the sort of depths of the folds of the figure, the musket, any of the powder apostles which they're carrying, the hair, sometimes the hat. Just speeds up that process, but you still don't lose the depth of the brown. So burnt umber is an amazing colour for all browns, obviously, but lots of other colours as well that are really good as a
I agree with that, actually. Yeah, really good.
And then I went for... Nobody mentioned grey. I couldn't imagine living without neutral grey. Just a really good neutral grey. No one's going to mix black and white, so I'm going to choose neutral grey as another great colour. Then I had 2 reds, and I think they go together. The first isn't called red; it's called Vallejo Cavalry Brown.
Oh yeah,
which is
lovely,
a really,
rich
really
colour,
rich, deep red sort of base.
Mm.
And I'd go for dark vermilion, really, because I like
Yeah.
it, which is a really bright red, which for medieval, ancients, 17th century, 18th century periods, you want something to pick the figure up. So dark vermilion is a great colour. So I was left with 2, and I went for something which, for the earlier periods, is probably just as useful as your khaki or your stone grey, and that's from the Panzer colour range, and that's Vallejo New Wood. It's a really lightish brown new wood, and that could be used as painting on top of burnt umber and highlighting spears or muskets or halberds or whatever. It could be used for strapping or reins on horses. A really, really useful colour. And also I went for flat brown, which sometimes I find it difficult to find a brown which really stands out. But the Vallejo flat brown is like a reddish brown, but it's not red and it's not brown.
No.
But it's a beautiful colour in its own right, and doesn't really need to be highlighted very much. So I picked that as being an amazing coat colour for anything which is medieval or 17th century, 18th century or ancients. So 6 really complementary colours, and you could paint a whole unit with that and the other 3 colours.
So what about brushes?
Well, for me, brushes, I use mainly a size 1 or 0 brush for most of the work around the figure. Starting off with probably a little bit larger to fill in the really big areas like a horse, like a size 2. And I tend to use Winsor & Newton Series 7.
Yeah.
Or for the larger sort of brushes, which are a bit cheaper, I've found a supplier which Michael Audrey is a good chum of mine, told me about, which is rosemary brushes. And I mentioned this to Vlad at Evesham a couple of years ago. And they're a cheaper alternative. They're not as nice a brush. They're mail order, but they're great to mail order from. And their brushes are really high quality. They don't last as long as the Winsor & Newton, but they're a really good, viable alternative.
And are they a sable or?
They're sable as well, yeah. I mean, I think the Series 7 are Kosminski or Kolinsky sable.
Yeah, that's right.
And the Winsor and Rosemary have different ranges as well, so some are Kolinsky and some are cheaper sable. But those are generally what I paint all the figures with, so anything between 0 and a 2. I've probably got some 00 for some really detailed work on things like the faces or particular heraldry or whatever you're trying to do, a really small, intricate design. I should also say that the other thing that I mentioned is I always use daylight lights and increasingly using a magnifier, a large magnifier. So your mother, who was a chiropodist and then became a lunatic, would remember that you used to have those large chiropodist lights which had illumination around the magnifying glass. I've got one of those, and that's amazing because you don't need to be using a visor or anything like that. You're just holding the figure up and you're painting it, and you get used to that very quickly.
Yeah, good point. Do you use any vision enhancers?
No, I really couldn't. I did try it once upon a time to paint with one of those same kind of... My dear old mum used to have one to do tapestry with. And, it was the kind of thing that, if you looked at the sun in it, it would burn a hole in the back of your head. It was a massive great magnifying glass. And I tried it with figures, and I just couldn't get on with it. Really couldn't. I found the depth of field very difficult to work out.
I totally agree with you. I bought one of those visors. After 10 minutes, I'd hurled it down the garden. So what I went and bought in the end was a set of Ready Reader spectacles. I use Ready Reader spectacles anyway. I just bought the really strong ones, size, the 3 multiplication. And whatever, it's not times 3, it's the 3 strength ones. And I just pop them on when I'm doing detail work with figures, and that's worked for me for years. And having them as spectacles is just so much easier, because if you're used to wearing glasses anyway, it's you're used to that.
Well, I think I'm quite lucky because I'm short-sighted.
Right.
It's easy for me to see things if they're at the end of my nose.
Right.
So actually, that works quite well for painting.
Right.
I think my ability to get in close and personal to the figures is actually improving as I become more and more blind.
Yeah. Okay, so I talked about my initial thing, which is to do a base coat and then dip. I do take it further than that, but does anybody else have to do a flat? Oh, I haven't talked about brushes.
Brushes next, which
Winsor & Newton Series 7.
for you
For
as
detail,
well.
yes. But I use Data and Rowney cheap brushes. They call their range Simply. I've got some here. This one here is a good example. It's a size 1. Data and Rowney, simple. It's an acrylic hair or whatever it is, which looks like I haven't washed this one either. But I just use these cheap brushes for doing big block painting.
So the first thing I noticed about that is that brush is naked. You haven't got a little top on the brush.
They get lost.
Top?
He means those
small
little plastic drain
tube
pipes that go over the top of
to
them.
clothe your brush. Your brush is naked, Richard.
I've got 700 brushes in that tub.
And they're all naked.
Yeah, they are, that's right.
You're using that brush, you're fiddling with that brush.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be doing that.
Yes, I should, because when the point goes, I throw it in the bin and buy another one.
Well,
I'm not from Yorkshire.
So see, I also use the Winsor & Newton brushes, Series 7 brushes.
You do put them,
and I've got them down to triple zero. But the more intricate ones, the ones that I think are my nicer brushes, I do keep those little plastic bits on as long as I can. And then once they're lost, then by then the brush is knackered anyway.
What I find,
but I'll use any old brush as long as it's got a decent point to it.
That's the point I was just going to make, and the point is the point, mate.
That's the point.
Sometimes a size 2 brush can have a nicer point than a size 00.
Yeah, I agree.
I bought a Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush, a 00, a month or two ago. When it arrived, it had an end on it like the end of a brick. It was just completely flat, totally useless. I use that brush now for cleaning my ears out or something equally horrible. I use that brush now for just putting a base coat on. It's totally useless. I would rather use cheap brushes like those Data and Rowney ones, which I tend to pick up a pack of 8 of them for something like £4.50 from Hobby World or Hobby Craft or whatever they're called. Yeah. And then when I come to do the detail, I use Winsor & Newton Series 7.
But there's sometimes you pick up those multi-packs and there'll be 1 or 2 in there that might actually last quite well. Some of them will go quickly.
Well, so flat heads, you can see them there, all those yellow brushes, flat heads for dry brushing, absolutely perfect.
Yeah. So one thing we thought we might just finish up with the brush discussion on, for your best brushes, does anyone use brush soap and brush preserver?
Yes, I bought some. I used it once. I put it on the shelf in my shed and never used it again. Not because I didn't like it, but just because I can't be bothered to walk and get it. What I normally use is washing up liquid.
Yeah.
And the advantage of using a really high quality Winsor & Newton Series 7 brush is you can put a blob of washing up liquid in the palm of your hand and you can get that brush and really scrub it. And the sable brushes will go back to a good, nice shape. With cheap brushes, you would destroy the brush in doing that. So I tend to use that if I have had a brush where I have accidentally left it and need to restore it, left it with some paint on, I'll do that again, and then I will use that really nice high quality brush soap. But I'm on my first pot of it and I've had it for 5 years.
So the brush soap I used and was thinking about was it's called the Masters Brush Cleaner and Preserver.
That's the one I use.
By General Pencil, and it's a sort of khaki beigey sort of plastic pot.
From America, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's beautiful stuff.
It is nice. Yeah.
If you keep using that with good quality brushes, that will help them.
What is it? Is it like a resin or something?
No,
like
it's just a soap.
Like a hair gel type thing?
It's more like a resin feel to it.
Yeah. It's a soap which is specially formulated for acrylics, watercolours and even oils. And it basically, you just put some in your hand and you wash your brush in it. But it gets the paint out of the ferrule.
I just put the brush in the pot and go like that.
Your brushes hate you, Richard.
You could just
Fortunately, my brushes are inanimate. I don't live in Disneyland.
Dear listener, if only you could see the way Sidney recoiled when Richard said that he stuck his brush directly in the pot.
I was horrified. The Brush Preservation League would be after you, Richard. Okay, so we've moved.
We're not on Beauty and the Beast, mate. This is singing brushes about to come and attack us.
Oh no!
Yeah.
So we've moved on from brushes, and I think before we go on to painting, it's probably time for painting technique, isn't it?
Yes.
Do we do painting technique
Well,
first?
I've done mine.
So.
The first stages are to block colour and dip.
Yeah.
But after that, I do a lot more.
Well, do you want to tell us what more you do after you've dipped or used your
It
army
depends.
painting?
Do any of you do a sort of halfway house thing? See, the dipping for me is the halfway stage or the end of the first stage.
But that dip though is the entire figure. You dip the entire figure.
The entire figure.
So I don't dip on that entire figure. I use washes, but only
No.
very carefully.
Well, I use washes very carefully applied. But once I've done my dip, I allow that to dry, And then what I do is I get my Winsor & Newton, maybe number 2, and I will start highlighting up from there with a fairly large, broad highlights. So tops of the legs, forearms, shoulders, that type of thing. And I will repaint things like all the strapping. The strapping has already got its base colour on there, and that's been painted with the dip. So I won't paint it perfectly, but I'll go over it with a fairly broad line. Then once I've done that, I'll add a bit of white to my colour, or maybe yellow if I'm doing a red, and then I'll go over it and just highlight it up.
Interesting.
And at that point, I will then start using the washes to add them carefully, so maybe around buttons, maybe around buckles. So the buckles on the British packs and webbing that I've just done, when I painted them, when I'd highlighted them up, I used a small 0 size brush to go over where the buckles were, and put a dark tone wash on that. And once that was dry, I then painted those buttons in brass.
It's interesting what you say about Halfway House, because do you remember back in 2012 when we started on Dux Britanniarum, I did the Saxons.
Yeah.
And you remember that was the first time I'd used dip, and I think I actually borrowed the army painter from you. And the first weekend I did 70 Saxons.
Yeah.
And I didn't work particularly hard on them because I blocked them out in colour and then used dip. And I think the first 70 done in a weekend weren't great. And then I did the Jutes, which were much better because I then got the hang of it, made different base colours, did the army painter, and then on the top of that started selectively painting. And in about 3 weeks I had a whole Saxon army, which I think you've still got, actually.
I have, actually. I was looking at it yesterday as I put it on eBay. But it's
and make a good price.
But no, you're right. But it's a case of, I know a lot of people who will paint and then use the army painter last. Yeah. That's not the way I use it at all. I use it as a halfway house to get not the highlights, but to get the depth on the figure.
And I used it for that. And I thought, when you're using particularly vivid colours for the second half, but when you're past half time, that really worked well. And those Jutes looked really menacing and really good because they had depth because of the army painter tone. Yeah. But you're also then painting more normally on selected part of the figures.
Exactly right.
Now, looking at them close up, they weren't the best in the world, but en masse, they were really effective.
Mine are, though.
Well,
no, you see,
of course.
I often feel that I ask myself some questions about washes because there's part of my head that says they're for lazy buggers.
They are.
Yeah. So I paint quite deliberately and quite carefully. So, for instance, that base coat you talk about applying, say you're doing the base of a red jacket, a dark red, you know, that lovely leather brown, or something that's your burnt umber that makes a lovely. See, I would probably apply that quite carefully, and then I would throw a wash on top. And I thought, well, why would I bother? Why did I bother painting that first bit carefully?
You don't.
Well, I'm just exactly. Yeah. But this is the key thing for me is this: I can't stop myself painting carefully because it's so much part of who I am that I'm quite deliberate and careful. Generally, I find it really quite difficult to splash it all over, as Henry would say. And that for me, I've still got that in my head about dips. Not so much washing, but certainly for dips.
See, I look at your paint style, and what I see is kind of the Kevin Dallimore shade up, shade up, shade up, shade up.
Yeah, that is me a bit. So that
and it works. It suits your painting style.
Yeah, I tend to. So I would start with if I was doing a red jacket, for instance. I probably would use Sydney. I'd have a black. Well, I might have a black undercoat. I'd have a burnt umber. I'd have a dark red, a mid red, and almost like an orange on top of it. As the highlight. Yeah. And I do that with a lot of my colours. I tend to paint the dark colours first. Well, I tend to paint jackets first, actually. Yeah. Whatever's going on with the figure, I tend to paint the jacket first because everything else goes over the top of the jacket.
Yeah, I agree.
So I paint the jacket, and then I will normally do dark. Start with the dark end of the colour spectrum and go up, with the exception of black, which I nearly always paint last. Because black is often the things that the boots or the hat or the stuff that actually you've got to go. I always end up going back to black to touch up.
Right.
So I tend to go through that way, but I will build my colours but I will use. We're not. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about washes yet.
Not yet.
But on that, I will use always. Or I will also possibly, if I'm doing that red jacket, I will do a red wash probably in between. The in between the main coat and the highlight.
Oh, you see, but you're replicating exactly what I'm doing.
Well,
but
maybe
I'm not just using it to to get the depth on the red jacket, I'm doing the whole figure.
Yeah. Yeah, but I would use a red wash on the red jacket, and then I'd use a slightly different colour wash on the bloke's face. Yeah. I'd use a ogrin wash or whatever it's called.
On
the hands.
Faces, you see, I use.
I think faces are different.
Wash.
We should talk about faces separately.
We should, yeah.
But so I build up in almost like that Foundry Dallimore style. But
so do you?
Well, I've gone, as you've got the couple of examples in the notebooks here. Although I did the Saxons way back in 2012 in that half dip, half painting method, I think by now I've just gone completely over to Nick's method really. So I use a 3-colour method really, and I make grids as regards the paints I particularly use. So there's a highlight, a mid-tone and a highlight. So I don't wash really at all. I don't dip, I don't wash, I just paint on. So whatever, there's the undercoat, then there's a base coat, there's a mid-coat. And then
but you do get wonderfully crisp colours, Sid.
Yeah.
Obviously, as an output from that.
Well, I think the thing is to try and find a strong colour as the base of the figure, and to really try and make that as bright as possible, because you're looking at the figure from a distance. Now that can be a bright khaki, or a bright stone, or a bright red, or an orange, or a yellow. Yeah. But you've got to really have one unifying colour for the figure, or ideally for the unit. I think some of the most difficult units to paint are those where every figure's in a different colour, like a Spanish guerrilla
or
unit, or militia, or
Confederates.
They're a real pain to do. But I think if you're using anything uniformed, you're really trying to find a tone which unites the unit. And I just do that 3-colour method. I don't really wash really very much at all. And
we noticed.
And I do feel that I should really try and speed up the painter by washing more. Maybe not dipping so much, but certainly using more washes. But to be honest, I think you get a better effect in some ways if you're just shading and colouring, just using the paints themselves.
Yeah. I think you have to know when to stop, though. I found myself sometimes wanting to apply just another little bit of highlight on that bit, another little bit on that, and you can overdo it.
See, I would say that the reasons I paint the way I paint are that I don't enjoy painting. It's a chore, but I want to get it done to a standard that I feel is reasonably comfortable. So I do want to see depth and highlights and things like that. But I basically consider everything I do when I paint as a cheat. The way everything I do is based on techniques that I have learned from other people that make me go, I'm not getting 100% effect, but I'm getting 95% really easily and can paint bundles of them quite quickly.
I think what's really interesting, all struck me about your painting, Rich, is that when you're looking at the table, they're always vivid, they're always dynamic, they're always really attractive on the table. And that's
don't pick them up.
No.
And when you look closely, you wish you hadn't.
It's not. It's not a diorama. It's not a game. No, I always think that it is wonderful when people photograph figures close up.
Yeah.
And we've got some examples here of painting books, and there's some amazing techniques of people who photograph figures from a very, very short distance. Certainly less than a foot. But really, wargames figures should be seen, I think, en masse, and they should be seen from a distance. And the distance they should be seen is about 3 or 4 feet away. I mean, that's the effect you're trying to get.
You've got a book there that I'm not going to name, but I bought one of them, and when I came to look at it to paint, a jacket for a certain figure, they were like 28 colours or something, and I thought, that's just not what I'm after. That for me is a book by somebody who loves painting figures. I loathe it. I want to get toys on the table. I want to get toys on the table quickly. I want to sit down on a Monday morning and think I've got to get an army on the table, a chain of command army, a platoon on the table for tomorrow night, and I want to crash them out and get that done, but I want it to look half decent, and I will put effort into doing things like hand painting German helmet decals, and I will put effort into painting Waffenfarbe and bits like that stand out, but it's very much faces and bases for me.
Well, there's a terrible trap to fall into as a wargamer, that you start to be good at painting, because then you start to get better, and then you want to get better, and you buy a book like this. I'm just holding War Games Illustrated Paints, which is a fantastic little magazine.
That isn't the one I was talking about. I've not seen that one, but it does look a lovely book.
It's a lovely book. It costs about £10 or £5. I can't remember what it was. And there's some great there are some really great suggestions in this small book about how to paint units really quickly. But then there's also the seductive things about how to paint borders or tartans, or the most ludicrous, ridiculous thing, how to paint golfer plaid trousers and corduroys. Now, I mean, they do look fantastic. In fact, I wish I had a pair of trousers like that. But you're never really going to see that.
I think you probably do, Sid.
You're never really going to see that on the tabletop.
No.
And I think that's the thing. You've got to rein yourself back in.
But your thing is,
I just painted some Argyle and Southern Highlanders in kilts, and I did the kilt, but I did sit down and think, right, how do I do this in 3 colours? And the effect is probably every bit as good as that.
Yeah, well, see, that's right. See, there's the thing about painting herring. The thing is, these are one figure sort of RPG type games. They're not, you're not painting 400 guys in herringbone. But I do think we can get overcomplicated. We can get carried away sometimes. I find with my World War II figures that sometimes when I've done the first 2 colours, actually sometimes I get a better effect if I stop there and not try to go into more detail. But I find it hard to stop. I find it hard to say...
How to paint the houndstooth tweed.
Yeah. Well, that's handy. If you haven't got a Harris tooth tweed jacket, you can paint one for yourself. So, and I think also there's a segue there, isn't there, really? It takes us into faces. And you said faces and bases make a difference. So
they do.
I wonder if we should talk about faces, because we have different ways of doing those.
Faces and flesh make a difference. It's hands as well. Hands make a big difference.
Yes.
How do you do yours, Sydney?
Well, the faces I do the same way as the other figures, so it's basically a 3 system. What I have noticed, though, is that it makes a lot of difference whether you go for a deep shade or a really lighter shade. So a colour like burnt umber, or a colour like hull brown, something which is really dark with a figure's face, that's kind of going to mean that you've got a very dramatic face. But if you're picking something which is a sort of a mid-brown, a beige brown as your base, and then adding the flesh to it, you're going to get a much softer figure.
Sid, I know you come from Hull, but claiming that Hull has its own colour brown is a bit much, mate.
It's patented. The whole city is painted that colour. If you've never been.
Hull brown. I do find that one of the things that I fail to do with any consistency is find a nice base coat for painting flesh on top of. To the degree that the way I do it now is to paint the face flesh all over, big flat block paint. Then I use the dip. But having used the dip, what I will then do is I will start off almost repainting the face, so just leaving the very heavily lined creases. I'll do that again, do the face, so all the cheekbones. I do the top lip in pink. I do every one of my figures has got a Charlton Heston chin, so I do 2 big dots on his chin, which I then highlight up later in the process, and I highlight the cheekbones. And the ears, around the ears, and then what I do is I put a flesh wash on it, a very light one though, with mixed with water. And having done that, I go back and do the final highlight again. So I just try and get that detail right. And
that is quite detailed compared to your approach to the rest of
the
film,
absolutely.
That's,
absolutely.
In terms of attention span, you're concentrating on that face.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually enjoy painting faces. I never paint eyes. What a waste of time. Because they all come out looking like Marty Feldman. They look ridiculous. They're great big googly eyes leering up at you. And I just think, I can't be bothered. I can't be bothered. At that moment, when you look at him, he shut his eyes like I do in family photographs.
So let me speak up in defence of the eye painters, because
the googly eye club.
I have painted eyes, and I have painted eyes that look all right, and I have painted eyes that look terrible.
Yeah.
And the thing with them is you never know which ones you're going to get when you start the process. And you can do 3 figures do fantastic eyes, and the 4th figure is exactly the same. Does look like he's having the best orgasm he's ever experienced. So eyes, and the way that I do eyes is I have a tiny pinprick of paint, and I do 4 dots. So each eye would have 2 white dot.
Oh, so you go black, white, black, white, black.
No, I would just do the white. So white. 1 bit near your eye, and then the next bit on the out part of your eye. You know what I'm saying there? your eye is colour in the middle and white on two edges, isn't
Red
it?
and blue.
If yours weren't so slitty and closed, you'd be able to see white on either side of your
right,
iris,
I see what you're saying.
So, So the thing is, I'm 3 feet away from you and I can't really see the whites of your eyes.
No.
And we're talking about figures that you're standing 3 feet away from. So
true.
I tend to, I know I have a bit of a reputation, people say I paint eyes, but actually most of the time I don't paint eyes. But when I'm trying to do competitions, sort of really nice figures, and I think, oh, he looked lovely with some eyes, I will add some eyes and then think, oh, what did I do that for? He now looks like he's completely cross-eyed. But
he's a retard.
And when I'm doing the faces, I will use a dark. Citadel do a colour called rat skin flesh, which is a bit like a sort of, a bit like a flat brown, really.
Yeah.
And you can use that as your base coat. Then with the flesh over that,
Right.
then I will put a wash on,
Yeah.
and I'll probably use a Citadel wash. I'll probably use whatever they call it. What's what I've got at the moment? I did write it down because I knew we were going to talk about it, and it's called something we'll come back to. Here we go. What's it called? It's called a wash.
Great podcasting. This.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Well, the one I use now is called Reichland Flesh Shade. This is the absurd thing with these. Reichland Flesh Shade, which is okay. But they used to do one called
Dr.
Ogrin.
Goebel's paint range.
They used to do one called
It's a very,
Ogrin.
very pale white.
They used to do one called Ogrin Flesh, which was
Ogrin
Flesh, whatever
right.
it is. You think this is bad? You should try standing in the Citadel, the Games Workshop shop, and asking for this. And that they're quite nice. And then I might do a little touch of like a light flesh. Vallejo do a light flesh colour, which actually I would use to just zip across the eyebrows.
Right.
And
Goebbels flesh.
and then there's a little
Lips
top lip and cheekbones
in white, yeah.
in almost white.
I do my bottom lip in a sort of reddish. I use basic flesh tone and add a bit of red, so it looks like you've got a. It's not red. It doesn't look like It's not a trip to the local knocking shop, but it's a red bottom lip.
I sometimes do the two bits on in between the eyes when you're frowning.
Too much detail.
Little bit of a,
too much detail.
like a little, two little pointy bits when you're frowning.
Sydney, you were face techniques were you?
Cheeks,
ears. What do you highlight?
Not really.
Smiley faces, big emoticons.
No, really. It's nose, lips, chin. I like to have cheekbones, strong, prominent cheekbones. A little bit on the lips, occasionally when you've got
Bit of rouge.
17th century, a little bit of rouge, a couple of beauty spots.
Yeah.
Tried out basing figures with an undercoat in purple to give them a particularly strange pallor from the mercury.
Liberace look.
From the mercury powder that they used to use in Versailles.
Fabulous.
But that's just a bit of ridiculousness, to be honest. I mean, most
Fun though.
Fun, yes, but it's a particular for the command figures, a particular feel to the armies.
Right.
Purple heads, that might be just a thing.
Well, you never know.
Some people do.
Okay, so we've dealt with faces, we've dealt with painting techniques.
Yeah.
The last thing perhaps to do.
Should we touch on hands really quickly? Fingers?
You need hands.
Well, we were just going to come up to fingers and hands, but since you've jumped the gun, Nick,
Fingers
go
and
on.
hands. Get the fingers in
Fingers
there
and
early.
hands.
Well, I'll paint fingers. I will paint fingers on 28mm figures if they're there.
Make a lot of
and get
difference.
away with it. Yeah.
It does,
Yeah.
doesn't it?
And I've even been known in the past to put little sort of fingernails on the end,
Uh,
but they look a bit dated.
Do you remember the Kevin Dallimore hands where they used to highlight the
knuckle
fingernails,
stuff,
every
yeah.
knuckle?
Highlight the knuckles,
They were
yeah.
beautiful. If I had that skill, I would do that. I don't.
It's not really paint, it's mainly paint blobbing as opposed to
It
anything
is.
else.
I
It's just
can't
really
paint blob.
bizarre.
When I paint blob, I'll get a paint blob and it'll be covering half the hand. That's the biggest knuckle in history. So I just paint the fingers, and if the knuckles are really prominent, so let's say grasping something, then I would just dot them. But as for those lines on the back of the hand, I can't do that. It's just beyond me.
I mean, again, it's one of those things that you might do for the commander in the army, Suleiman the Magnificent,
Yeah,
or whoever it
absolutely.
is.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's not for your rank and file. So the last point is
That's a
probably
good point.
varnish. Oh,
Yeah.
now this is potentially a horror story for so many wargamer painters. And so many nightmares on TMP and colloquially when you're chatting to people about it. Even the great painters have talked to far better than me. I mean, they've all had nightmares with varnish at some point.
I watched a fabulous video on YouTube by a guy called the Terrain Tutor, who is really good if you're looking to make terrain. Very interesting. He has a Patreon-based show, which I would recommend people to have a look at and see whether they fancy following him. But he did a really, really interesting program about aerosol cans and explained how they work, how you have to have them warm, how you have to shake them up, and I thought, this is so interesting. And the next day, I painted a unit, and I thought, now I know the secret to getting it right. And I sprayed it, and it went completely wrong because I hadn't allowed 24 hours for that skanky dip to dry. And so it then affected, having got all the varnish stuff right, you have to get everything right, basically. You have to make, and if you are using this army painter dip, apparently you have to give it 24 hours. Now, because I paint the way that I paint, which is crash it out and get it done, I will often only let that dry for 8 hours or so before I'm on to the next stage, and then I'll often be finished after 5 or 6 hours. So it's only 13 hours since that's gone on, and I then, that's what I did. I varnished it, and it was a complete disaster because there's still moisture trying to get out. But anyway, it's well worth looking at that program, which tells you a lot about aerosols. Apparently, you have to get them warm. It's worth putting them. You can either run them under a tap, or I've started putting them in a bowl of warm water to get them up to temperature, because that affects the propellant. The temperature in there affects the propellant. And if I'm dealing with an enamel varnish, which I like to use, Humbrol enamel, matte enamel, then I have to shake it up for 2 minutes, make sure it's all the right temperature, and that tends to mean that you avoid the pitfalls of frosting, which is all about moisture.
And Sydney, do you put your aerosol in warm
water
to get it up to temperature?
I don't. I confess I don't. I don't use an aerosol varnish at all. I use brush on Humbrol gloss, and then a top coat of Daleroni soluble matte acrylic varnish. So it's an art-based varnish which dries completely flat. So you've got the protection of the Humbrol gloss, which you just paint on with a brush.
Is that out of a tin?
Yeah,
the little
tin.
Traditional tin.
Traditional tin,
yeah.
Either I think it's 12.5 or you get big tins of the gloss varnish.
Right.
The disadvantage of that is it does tend to sometimes change the colour a little bit of some of the paints that you've used. So one of the things I always try and do is just paint the brighter things brighter, because the varnish will always take it down a little bit. And then the matte varnish on top to make sure it's matte. And the thing with the gloss varnish, if the matte varnish over the years ever gets a bit sort of worn off, as they can do on the acrylic varnishes, you can always just retouch up the figures.
Interesting. So you don't spray anything on your figures from start to finish, do you?
No, I don't. I'm not a great spray can user. I mean, I'm quick with a brush.
Presumably you've never bought one based on that conversation today.
Well, you lent me your airbrush at one point. I think I did use it a couple of times about 10 years ago, and I just didn't really like it. I didn't get on with it. So it's what you get on with, I think, as much as anything else.
Can I have it back?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I sold it on eBay.
Well, I use... so sometimes when you're painting a figure, there's always parts of the figure which when you're looking at it raw, it looks like it's glossier than the other parts, and it shouldn't be. So sometimes you get a tunic or a pair of trousers that will look shiny.
Especially true when you use dip.
Yeah. So what I will do normally with that is that I will give it I've got some Vallejo matte paint on brush on varnish,
right.
And I will use that on that part of the figure just to dull that down. And then once that's dried, I will spray that. I will spray everything again back in the garage.
Right.
Same shoebox. Only this time I'll spray it with varnish, and I will probably use Testa's dull coat if I've got some.
Right.
That's been quite tricky to get hold of. But I still love using that. I think it gives a really flat finish. Or I will use Winsor & Newton do a matte spray as well, which is good for craft work. Sort of kids' toys and that kind of thing, which also works all right and is nice and flat. Sometimes, if I think it's going to be really durable, in the past I've used like a clear acrylic spray over the top, and then that of course that makes the whole thing look like a chess piece, a sort of shiny chess piece, because they tend to be quite satiny, and then you dull it down with the testers.
The first coat that I give it is one of those big cans that you get from craft stores or. Whatever it's called, which are like crystal or something like that. They're called, and it's for encapsulating in plastic almost. And I spray it with that.
I think that might be the same kind of one.
The
that
gloss
I use
stuff,
the
gloss paint. I haven't moved it in here because the workshop's not finished yet, so I haven't got any. But I'm sure it's called crystal. It's a blue and black can, and they're about the size of a pint glass. a straight pint glass, not a dimple one, because that would be ridiculous. But that's I use a high gloss, and I know a lot of people tell me you don't have to gloss paint and then gloss undercoat and then matte undercoat, but I honestly believe that a gloss undercoat protects figures, and especially if I'm doing plastic figures, I think it's anything that you're adding, especially with this plastic encapsulating thing, stops things like bayonets breaking off. So I happily spray with this gloss stuff, and then when that's done, I try and use Humbrol enamel rather than the acrylic varnish, because that gives a beautiful flat finish. And the funny thing is, what you were saying, Sid, that coat of matte varnish does tend to tie colours in together.
It does. It does bring them down.
Occasionally, what I will do is just go over and do a little bit of re-highlighting on things like straps that I think have basically submerged into the figure, especially with plastic figures. Sometimes they don't have the depth of sculpting that metal figures have, and so just putting a quick highlight just makes it pop out a bit more.
It is worth saying with sprays also that you do have to be careful about where you're using them.
Because,
I know
horrible
I'm
things.
not going to add health and safety warning, but actually, my missus comes home, if I've been spraying varnish, she can smell it in the house long after I've been able to notice that it's gone. So, and having it in your room is not a good idea for a double reason. I remember when I was a student and I was painting in my room, and in the morning I put spraying varnish under my arms instead of deodorant, and that's not the best way to start your day, I can tell you.
Well, that's a wonderful idea.
Especially as you're 28 stone, not 28 mil.
It went on beautifully, but then 5 minutes later you're wondering why you can't lift your arms up.
Fantastic.
But you're so well preserved.
I am.
If anyone scratches under there,
yeah, my armpit hairs are still the same ones that I had in 1990. Yes. Or whatever it was.
So
1988.
Move on from
like
varnish, and then
And
just
armpits.
as we start, hopefully to wrap up, the last big thing is, of course, basing. How do we base our figures? Because that's kind of an art, and that one of the things I think over the last 5-10 years people have really sort of started to focus on is basing. I mean, there's not just the sort of textured basing, but the real growth of tufts and flowers and grasses, which are really amazing at the moment and very, very heavily available. So, guys, going to start with you, Nick, first.
Yeah.
Basing. I mean, your bases are really nice. It's one of the first things you notice about your figures.
Well, people say that you do notice bases and faces, don't you? I have varied over time about the way that I do bases. I used to use a base text that was from Irregular Miniatures or somebody, and somehow you run out of these things, so you start to improvise.
Base text.
And I'd use a dark brown.
I used their stone grey one, I think it was.
And you mix a bit of gravel into it.
Light earth, I think it was.
That's right. Mix a bit of gravel into it. Apply that, or add some PVA. These days, I've also used some of that. I have used that hard as nails, or no more nails, it's called. But to be fair, that doesn't really, I don't think, do a very good job across the whole base. So I'm normally looking for some kind of base text material. So we're looking at what is it? It's a base. It's a mix of PVA and sand material. Glue that dries hard. And apply that around the base. We're normally using coins. Let that dry, and then probably apply a top coat of paint to that if it needs it, if it's not already the right colour.
Okay.
Dry brush it, and then add some tufts to it. So I'll probably dry brush a dark colour, heavy dry brush of a dark colour. Let's assume it's like a chocolate brown to start with. Because I might also mix some what's the word? Emulsion paint in there, possibly even as well.
Yeah, I use emulsions for
get an emulsion to get the right colour. So the basic thing is about the dark earth colour.
Yeah.
Then a fairly heavy dry brush on top of that once it's dry, and a light brush of bone or this Ushabti bone, which is brilliant for just picking up highlights once that's done. Yeah. And then I'm a big user of tufts. I love tufts, and I love to put scenic bits on the base, provided it's reasonable and sensible to do so, because they do bring the figure alive.
They are nice.
I've got Vietnam figures that have got sort of big chunks of aquarium plant, almost coming out of their boots, because it just makes the figures, I think, come alive and makes you realise. These are quite. They're obviously very going to be used in their one environment. They look a bit daft. You put them in a living room, but they
Stalingrad.
It brings the figures to life. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, this is the other thing. So winter figures as well.
Yeah.
Do you put snow on the basis of winter
Yeah,
figures?
definitely.
Or do you say, well, actually, that bit you're standing on doesn't happen to have any snow on it? It's all a matter of personal choice, isn't it? And there's so many options, so many really good tufts that you can use that really, there's no excuse, so you shouldn't go to town on a base and get a really good outcome.
Sid, how do you base?
Pretty much the same. So,
Are yours already on bases with earth on?
if I possibly can, I want to paint the figure with a base on. But when you're basing units of figures in sort of anything before, like Franco-Prussian War, it doesn't really work. You can't really have sort of 6 figures on a single base. So I'm generally painting 2 or 3 figures on a base when I can. I fix them to the base, and then I leave the other spaces and paint the figures separately. But when all the figures are on the base, then it's time to texture the base, and I use PVA and sand, well, a mixture of different grains of sort of sand and gravel. And when that's on there, I normally run a very loose PVA over the top of that to seal it all in. And then I use a Humbrol enamel, and I've been looking up, I think it's either middle stone or light earth I use, and wash that on, and then I build it just like you do. And funny enough, my stone grey is one of my colours for my top light brush over the base. So I want something which is really light. I don't want a deep dark base. Now on the First World War figures, because all the trench boards were dark grey and dark brown, we used those as the base colour and highlighted, not so much with tufts, but with things like bricks, which were then able to paint bright red and orange, which gave the base some differential. But really for anything ancients or medievals or black and shot, really, really neutral sandy base, and then the tufts are doing all the work. So grasses, flowering sort of grasses and stuff like that. And the tufts are so good these days that they're really doing all the lifting on the base. To be honest,
purely that you don't use static grass or anything like that.
I used to use static grass a lot. I've completely gone away from that now. I just use tufts.
Do you use static grass?
I do use static grass. I'm very conscious that I don't
flocks
have. I'm very conscious that I don't have one of those electrocution devoices that makes everything stand up. So I tend to.
If we did, there'd only be two of us on this show, wouldn't there?
Wouldn't be the best thing that we'd be able to use. So I have done those, and I do use. To be honest, I've got a big box of all kinds of basing shit and crap and flock and God knows what else, and I will use any of it.
Technical basing term, folks.
Yeah, I will use it. I'm not fussy, but if it catches my eye and I fancy it, I'll put it on there. As I said at the beginning, I'm the steptoe of painting. I just if it quite eclectic. If it's there, I'll just go for it.
I remember you based some figures on bar mats and Weetabixes.
Beer mats used to make fantastic bases.
Yeah, they did. If you're
cut them up. I mean,
if you're of no fixed abode,
That's
they're perfect. Yeah, great.
It's changed a lot over time, hasn't it? The way we paint, the materials we use, the basing.
Yeah.
That we try
totally changed.
Really
totally changed. I'm with you actually, Sid. I use sharp sand. In fact,
big sack of it.
There's a big sack of it right next to me, which looks like it's the builder's stuff. It's not. It's a big sack of basing stuff. I've got that there drying out because it's got to be dry.
And how much was that, Rich?
It was about 30 bob. £1.50
£1.50
in English, and it is a builder's sack of sharp sand.
Yeah.
The reason I use sharp sand is it's sand with bits in, smallish bits. I've said it before, you can sieve it. If you want pure sand, you got the sieved. If you want the rocks, you got the rocks. So you can get any blend you like out of it. So I just put PVA on, add that on, then like you, once that's dry, do a very weak, maybe 8-to-1, 6-to-1 mix of water with PVA to hold that in place. Once that's done, I use my standard terrain paint, which is a big household pot of external brown paint, which is called bitter chocolate. So sort of Sandtex or other brands are available from your local home base or whatever. And then I just use my same terrain paints for that. I use a couple of Crown match pots, which I use for terrain, just to dry brush a sort of a chalk chip is one colour, and then on top of that I'll put what's called something like basket weaver or something ridiculous. One of these, I'm painting my room Etruscan brown. And then finally I will highlight with a bit of white, with a very, very light white, so picking out any rocks and things like that. After that's done, I don't use a lot of clumps for your rank and file. I save them for officers. So, or if you get a large base with maybe a sniper on it or something like that, I might put those nice bits of terrain on.
Yeah.
It depends what I'm doing. For example, the Japanese at the moment, I've mixed up a mixture of herbe de Provence and clump foliage. Excuse me, the clump foliage I put through the whizzing machine, coffee grinder thing, and that made it very small, and I put that on to suggest jungle debris. But then I still went round the edges and did bits of little tufts of static grass.
It's interesting because I'm looking at Nick and I can see that with bitter chocolates and chocolate chips and herbe de Provence, Nick
Lovely.
is about to eat your bases.
Yeah, I love
Eat
this.
my bases. But
I love this workshop. That's why I come here so often. But the other thing on that though is I think it's quite clear from that we've actually you are the kind of guy who's whack it out, get the figure out, all it looks good. Don't really care what it looks like. Get it on the table and then chuck it back in the box at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Sydney, you're the complete opposite of that, where you are actually display case figures, beautiful pieces of artwork, and that labour of love shows. And I'm somewhere in the middle there because I do some that are more like you and sometimes more. It's just all war games will be somewhere on that spectrum.
spectrum, yeah, we are a spectrum.
And I think that's absolutely right. And I think what we've shown is that there's no right or wrong way to paint. And often painting is about the little tips and tricks and techniques we've learnt over the years, really finding out what works best for us at different times with different armies. So we have kind of described 28mm and 20mm. We haven't really gone down to 6mm and 2mm and 10mm. But that's
well,
another
anybody
day.
wants to know how to paint in 2mm, Sid, should check in on one of your other
Tune
podcasts.
into either Neil and Neil's podcast and Andy's podcast.
If you're not asleep yet, there's still time to download.
Right.
But it's been a long chat and we're not going to be running quite that long. But before we go, we've got a very large number of Lardy Games days coming up, which are open to all comers. In fact, we'll be heading down to Southampton in our next show on another Lardy road trip as we visit an event named Come and Have a Go If You Think You're Lard Enough, run by War Games celebrity columnist Mark Peaches Backhouse on Saturday the 23rd of March. Maybe, before we give all the details, we should briefly just say, what is a Lardy Games Day? Nick and Rich, what is a Lardy Games
Well,
Day?
it's an event, organised event normally that requires a public space or somewhere where you can have a group of gamers coming together. Veteran Lardies running games or novices who want to come along and try. Totally non-competitive, friendly atmosphere, no experience needed. Play any game set from the Lardy range. And even your own adaptation of that rule set. If you're taking sharp practice and playing it with Martians, then you can do that. It normally finishes off with a social afterwards, maybe a beer, perhaps an overnight if you're so inclined.
Beer and a curry type of thing,
Yeah,
usually available. But the important thing I think to say is it's an opportunity for people who think, oh, I've heard about that, to come along, and people will be running games for them. The figures will be provided. Just bring your, dice and a tape measure. But it's a great opportunity to meet like-minded people around the country. Some guys I know who don't have a local war games club travel across the whole country, attending loads of these because they really like the atmosphere. But it is smashing for people to have an opportunity to check out the rules and learn them from people who are experienced in them.
Thanks very much. And I think the point can't be made too strongly. But those are really friendly events.
Yeah,
I mean, they're absolutely great people, really friendly events. It's the heart of wargaming. And you're guaranteed a good welcome and a great game. But the one thing, I suppose, is that they do take some planning. So you need to book a place to make sure that you're catered for in every way and to play the games that you want to play. And details will be found on the TooFatLardies forum in the section named The Ambassador's Reception. So coming up, we've got War Lard in Durham on the 13th of April. The Durham War Games Club have a splendid permanent wargaming setup in what's the former officers' mess of the Yeomanry Cavalry Barracks there. And it's the 7th year for that event, and it's always a fantastic day out.
Great day out in the northeast, absolutely fabulous. Really friendly bunch of guys.
Great people up there, amazing part of the country, one of my favourite parts of England.
Yeah.
You can go to the forum and get details or drop us an email with a contact page on the website, and we can put you in touch with the organiser. And that's a day which draws people not just from the northeast, but also from all over the UK.
Yeah, there's still a few places available there. That's the week after Salute, so if you haven't spent all your money at Salute, well, it won't cost you anything. Usually a Lardy day just costs a few quid, £5, £10 or whatever, just for the cost of covering the hall and things like that. It's not about, we're not there to sell you anything, but there are places available for that, so get in contact with us and we can put you in contact with the Durham War Games guys there.
And secondly, a bit further away in both time and geography, we have Deep Fried Lard in Edinburgh on the 6th of July.
Yeah.
And that's a change of date due to other events in Scotland this summer. But Deep Fried Lard is always a great day out. And Richard, I think you're attending again for the 7th year on the trot, and I'm hopefully going to be there as well.
Good, excellent. Well, it's certainly a fabulous opportunity to meet a great bunch of guys up there in Scotland from both East and West Coast, get together as the Clan MacLard to meet, and there have been some superb games there. Great venue at Musselburgh Rugby Club, which is just outside Edinburgh. So there's a nice bar if you feel the need for a beveragio during the day, and then a few beers afterwards in Stag's Bar, which CAMRA claim is the best pub in Scotland. The same family have been running this pub for nearly over 150 years, and they just about know how to do it, obviously, with that experience. It's the CAMRA best pub in Scotland year on year, so that's great. Excuse me. And a curry locally afterwards, which is always jolly.
And moving even further afield from beautiful Scotland and the wonderful town of Edinburgh, James Manto in Canada has got in touch to say that the Hot Lead Convention in the beautiful town of Stratford, Ontario, will feature games of both What a Tanker and Chain of Command. That's on the weekend of the 29th to the 31st of March. And James says that all of the Lardy games will be participation games, and people can just walk up and spend 20 minutes or so trying them out, or register to play in advance for the full game experience. That sounds fantastic, James.
It does, doesn't it? Talking of Canada, Sean Souter and Seth Welton of the Canadian Lardy clan will be at Can Games in Ottawa on the 17th to 19th of May, running What a Tanker, a dust up in the desert. So if you're in Ottawa, why not join them and get tanking?
And finally, we can't...
What at Ottawa?
And finally, we can't forget Salute XL in London.
I wish we could. No, I'm looking forward to it. Always
We
a
can't
cracking
and
day.
must not forget Salute on the 6th of April, where we will be running Chain of Command, and great friend of the show, Dave Brown, will be flying the flag of our sister company, Ron Ricefitz Press, and running General Darmay. And if you're in London for that one, please come and say hello to Rich, Nick, myself, Emma, Dave and the rest of the Lardy team. Great to see Dave again.
And you can do more than that, because you can come along and play Chain of Command, because we'll be doing it on a participation game where people can dip in and dip out, is the idea, I think. So you
Very
can
much so.
Get your hands on the toys and play some of this stuff.
And the idea, we're going to have mentors there who are experienced in the rules, who are going to be able to help people who haven't played before but who want to have that cock experience, so to speak.
And we think that's going to be Far Eastern cock.
It will be. It will
Probably.
be. It will be. Not just the east end of London, but we're going to be running a game set in Malaya.
Wow. So not quite wok, cock, but something fairly nearby.
What cock and two smoking dice trays.
Yeah. Well,
So that's
I have
all.
no idea what you just said, but there we are. Let's move on.
So that's all for tonight. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the next Oddcast. My thanks as always go to Rich and Nick and to Roger Barraclough and the gang, who are going to play us out after a very quick shout out to Kevin in Kettering, Dave in Cambridge and Randy in Ottawa, all of whom wrote in requesting a signed photo of me. And finally, Donald McIntyre in Michigan, who currently has 30 inches of snow outside his front door and hopes that a mention from me might just warm the cockles of his heart. Good luck, Donald. Thank you all, and good night.
In tonight's show, Sydney Roundwood was joined by Nick Skinner and Richard Clark, with music by Roger Barraclough and his band.